I had a thought because my friend wanted to go to like a random diner before everybody's 9 o'clock work, as most of my friends work at 9 to 5. I thought about annoyance around community making and how community making most of the time is really, really annoying. I think it's probably the conversation that everybody has had at this point. Community feels really hard right now. There's been many scholars and video essayists that have kind of like really investigated that, have really done very deep and wide and analytical videos about that. And I do agree with a lot of what is being said. You know, it's a mixture of capitalism, the culture of labor that is set up in the United States especially, and convenience culture, another way of saying capitalism. Everything feels really, really hard, whether I have to drive to see my friends, if I want to do a drop-in. It feels like when you see your people, you're doing highlights. It feels like you're doing like high-level updates, but not necessarily feeling like you are there, even if you're having a good time. And after you've left, you actually feel more drained. And I think that has to do with, in my opinion, the lack of seeing each other, because the fact that we have to program, architect a time to meet with each other is obviously because of how labor-centered this country is. The intimacy feels like it's missing in a lot of community making because we don't see each other often. It has everything to do with frequency and how we see each other. I wrote a Substack post addressing how community feels really hard for like a lot of people, including myself, who is a transplant in this country and is trying to find my rhythm and pace with finding different ways of being in community with people. Convenience tax is what I call like the thing that capitalism gave us is a lot of ease, frictionless shopping, frictionless ordering of food when I want it, right? I don't have to ask for any help as long as I have some money in my pocket. Everything that we do, from the way that we stream music, from the way we engage with our friends over text, having these like really deep conversation over text, and then when you meet, you kind of feel a little drained because the labor and the effort is done in that liminal space or is not done enough. It feels like we are connecting with our friends when we have spare time. And I've said this before and I will die on this hill. Community is not an option, but also community requires a great deal of labor and effort. Of course, we talk about capitalism, the larger systemic things at play, but individual labor and effort is also a part of community making. There's this thing of like, people don't let people into their home anymore, their private space. People have very rigid routines. People buy stuff for themselves or their partner. At most, they purchase stuff as gifts for birthdays or holidays. At most. This is a very generalized observation. I just want to say that. So I always have to say that because there's going to be like, you know, a few people that are going to be like, well, in my community, yes, absolutely. I'm not talking about every single instance and every single community. There is, 8 billion people on this earth. There's always going to be an exception. Like, so one of the things convenience culture has afforded us is creating routines that feel like ours. A lot of us grew up in homes that feel like chaotic and we didn't have a lot of power, autonomy. And I think we are building that now. We have gone a little too far to the point we have created this like rigid routines that you are living for the weekend, and even on the weekend people are recovering from the weekday because it's so draining to be around other people. I think community is being annoyed. Without annoyance and being inconvenienced, it's really hard to build intimacy and community. I truly believe in that. Asking for help, asking for things, asking for a ride to the airport, asking for someone to bring you food when you're sick. Those are all things that feel like inconvenience, but are the things that build intimacy. When we start to recognize this, we start to get to a place of like, wait, how do I curb this? How do I do this differently? For me, my metric of fulfillment is not intimacy and great, beautiful gathering that felt magical at every time, but rather being around people as often and as frequently as possible. Being annoyed, being ridiculously over it. Even at family reunions, people are not showing up as much because we have gone toward a place of overcorrecting and saying like, this is my routine, it's a Sunday, and Sundays I unwind. I don't really see people. And I get that. Again, I think that makes us lose a large majority of our community. I think you get to a point within this rigid effort to create these routines and bubble for yourself. You get to a place where you are more and more isolated, and you are confronted with not necessarily solitude, but really isolation. You're not sure how to get out of it. It feels like a maze. I also feel like sometimes at the beginning of stages for a very long time, until it becomes this embodied practice, it's gonna feel like labor. Community is going to feel labor for a very long time because it has been practiced out of us. So it will feel like awkward, not aesthetic. You might get people at your place and there might not be enough seatings because you have spent creating shrines and home for you, and at most you and your partner. But for the most part, if you're living by yourself, it's going to feel like, oh, this home doesn't feel like it's gonna host people. Initiating is going to feel really hard and clunky. People might not show up for a while because it's so easy not to show up. I still go back to that stand-up that John Mulaney did years ago, where he talks about like it's so easy not to show up at things. And I truly believe that is one of the easiest things not to do. I think we have an image of how community feels. We romanticize it to the point where we start to actually lose our grip to reality and to kind of have these like controlled ideas of what community is going to feel. So a lot of us think that community is this romanticized aesthetic idea of like these beautiful like things that we see on reels, like picnics and garden parties, grilling parties, clubbing at like on a random Wednesday. Those are the things that we associate with community. But community sometimes feels like taking a walk on a Monday morning because it feels like that's when you can fit it into your schedule. Community feels like wanting to bed rot at the end of a 9 to 5 and rather choosing to go to a pottery class is offered in your neighborhood association or something and just going to that instead. It's going to feel like work. It's going to feel like effort. I think a lot of us spend time in thinking community being this complete thought. There's also going to be fluctuations of seasons where people may not be wanting to be in community as much, so you may show up differently. Maybe you're making soup in the middle of the winter and dropping it off at someone else's house. Maybe it's a FaceTime because it's really hard to travel 19-20 minutes outside of your home in the deep winter. There is many ways of practicing community. I think what has been afforded to us as a result of capitalism, as a result of the rigid routines and the convenience, the practice is going to look like letting go of some control. It also would look like letting some annoying people into your space. I'm not talking about toxic people. Maybe you're having a gathering. The gathering is going to include someone who has a partner that you don't necessarily love, and that person seems not as harmless, but they are annoying. You don't see eye to eye on everything, but they seem like they are an extension of this person. Therefore, you let them into your home. It's the functional thing to do. I think we have to let go of this idea that it's going to feel like this beautiful, magical experience with some outcomes that are going to feel really dreamy. I think about like Wizards of Oz, and you know, when Dorothy goes into the yellow brick road and then to meet Oz, and then Oz ended up being this illusion. And sometimes we talk about community similarly. What we're going to get is a fake wizard. Some person who's pretending to puppeteer a whole powerful thing, and the things that you find along the way, the practice along the way, the people that you meet along the way is what we're trying to get, rather than the destination of this magical, powerful wizard who's going to change our life. You don't need to be purchasing new hosting material, new trays, new tables, new chairs, new TVs, so that people feel comfortable in your space. I think about the time when my dad immigrated here. They were living in the Bay Area in Oakland, and he did not speak the language very well. He was working as a parking attendant. During that time, my dad used to tell me they would have 12, 13-hour days, and they would go to a cramped apartment that my aunt and a bunch of people lived in, including my dad. It was probably like 1 bedroom or maybe 2 bedroom. They would have a party, a kickback, and they would have food, they would have drinks, they would try to basically find a moment of solace, a moment of being together. And that intimacy saved them, that let them survive that time when you were a new person in this country, when you felt unwanted, when you felt like you have left your country and have basically built a new home, a new culture for yourself, away from your family, away from your partner, away from your newborn child. I think these are all really challenging things. They weren't trying to create these rigid routines of privacy and routines that felt like they were only serving them. The routine was being in community. My dad is not a very getting out there, extroverted type of person, but there were people around him, like my auntie and a couple of other his friends, that were really, really in the practice of being with each other, cooking communally, listening to music, dancing, smoking, drinking beer. That was the practice. When my dad tells me that story, I do imagine those years being really difficult, very challenging, very annoying, because there were people that probably were just causing ruckus. But at the same time, that is survival. That is functional community. And I feel like in order for us to feel like we don't continually talk about community, have these lip services of community is important and romanticize community in this way, why aren't we in it, practicing? I think when we're in it, we realize that it's not this complicated thing. And most of the time, it's not going to be convenient. It's not going to be without annoyance, but it's going to be necessary. And I think that is kind of the point.